welcome to another episode of About the Authors, TV European Edition. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Hauntingly atmospheric, it had the whole room mesmerized. The Irish Examiner raved in describing Charleen Hurtubise's writing, while the New York Times has sung the praises of her work as searing and intimate, where the author's adept at description, the crisscross of dialogue and the rhythms of people coming in and out of rooms, on and off beaches, in and out of memories. In describing her novel, Saoirse, which Good Housekeeping has championed as stunning storytelling, as the author makes her mainstream breakout, while not forgetting The Polite Act of Drowning, her debut where the Irish Examiner praised the way with poise and insight that she traces how her characters are haunted by their past and devastated by the pain of loss, in an accomplished debut imbued with the conviction that we determine our destiny. And she joins us today to talk about it all. Charleen, welcome to the show. Now, exactly how young do you first remember becoming enchanted with the worlds of story?
I was always fascinated by the printed word. I come from a big family. There's nine of us, and I was number six. So all the old and the eight of us girls, the older sisters always were, they were in school, they were writing, and they would come home, and I was so envious. So yeah, books like, A Wrinkle in Time, usually books where there was, Ramona the Brave. I don't know if you remember Ramona the Brave. Um, these sort of things. But we always had, and my mom had, she was part of this, I think it was like Reader's Digest classics or books where I think they were condensed books, if I remember correctly. But I remember just even when I ran out of things to read, picking them up, having no idea what they were about, and still reading them, so yeah, so that I was always reading. And then I finally found my way into the books that I loved, Toni Morrison, uh, just um, all of these things that you start to discover as you become a reader. The libraries, like my high school library in particular, was great for discovering things.
Yeah.
I used to keep a journal. I think from the age of about 12 or 13, and just little jottings of the day. But when I really started coming into it was in high school and writing essays, and then in college, taking literature classes and having to respond to literature. And so I really didn't start to write creatively, or I guess it's all creative, isn't it? But I didn't really start to write down the stories probably well into my 20s. Um, and it was when I started to discover, like, do you remember the book White Oleander? So I would read like Nora, what was her name? Their Eyes Were Watching God, Nora Zeal, just these beautiful books. And I would have never read Toni Morrison and go, oh, I can do this, because I didn't think I could, because the language was just unreal and her experiences were unreal. So by the time I actually discovered a book that I thought, God, I can really relate to this. And I actually think I could write, my experiences, or they're not I mean, obviously they're fiction, but my emotional landscape. This book, White Oleander. And I said, that's when I bought a notebook to start create. I've always kept journals and diaries, but that's when I bought a notebook to start writing it down. Because I thought, yeah, I can tell these stories, and they were usually stories of um, the ones that really, really appealed to me were these stories of neglect, and these stories where you cannot assume the basic needs of the characters are being met. In other words, like, and the two novels that I've written about five novels, but the two I've had published, there is always this girl, and always this girl who I'm trying to get to a place of safety. And I feel like that is the literature, literature of dysfunction, for lack of a better genre term, is what I read and relate to. And so White Oleander was kind of the first in that area that I thought, and that's when I started trying, and it took another probably 10 years, maybe even 2 decades to actually put something down that somebody might consider publishing. So it's been a long haul, but
From there, let's travel with readers to the summer in 1985 in the small insular town of Kettle Lake, Michigan, where the aforementioned career-long fan, the Irish Examiner, invites us inside the headspace of Joanne Kennedy, who in the water feels suspended between being awake and dreaming. And the sense of teenage limbo is one I think we all remember from some point in our childhood. Talk, if you would, about creating what they paint as a sympathetic protagonist and an observant narrator who's attentively attuned to the natural landscape, and how thrilling it was to ignite her existence with the electric current of Lucinda arriving into town, confident, worldly, freewheeling, and comfortable in her body, and seeming to be everything Joanna isn't, and all they navigate together after that within the polite act of drowning.
So Joanne is it's really a of age novel. Her mom is in difficulties. She's having really a breakdown. She is going through some mental health issues. She has one of those past, where that came up through neglect. Not just only emotional neglect, but material neglect. Joanne's emotional needs are very much, material needs are very much met, but not her emotional ones. Whereas the character Lucinda, so anyway, so it starts off with this quiet girl, Joanne, and just trying to discover herself, and then this young girl, Lucinda, blows into town with all of her social deprivation, with all of her needs, with all of her trauma. And the two girls spend the summer trying to figure it out and getting into a little bit of trouble. But it really is the trajectory of a young woman trying to come to terms with herself, her sexuality, her family's trauma, generational trauma. And it's set on the Great Lakes in Michigan one summer. One hot summer. It's a working class area, and yes, they have, they have this beautiful and they very much have these working class issues and problems, and um, in their communication with each other, and but then you get people who are making a fortune off that, like the character with her tackle shop and her bait and tackle shop and her fishing business and her boat rental, and she's done very well off of that. And then you've got people who are just trying to, again, make ends meet, live in hand to mouth, and the tensions that this creates. But I think that's like that a lot, in any tourist destination. The Great Lakes, what's lovely about the Great Lakes, they're huge. There's a lot of coastline, isn't there? So I guess that can be spread out a lot. You get to places here in Ireland like Dingle, and how many pubs do they have? I think they say they have I don't know, it's some phenomenal number of bar stools versus actual locals. And it is a ghost town in the other months of the year. So yeah, I guess there is that tension as well, and having to deal with all these people who have, and people who can tour and people who can land into these places they have a lot, they have a lot of material wealth, and I do think these things create tension, absolutely.
The Brooklyn Rail would offer some glowing early praise for Saoirse, from the gorgeous nature of the writing of Ireland to your resisting the urge to sensationalize the decade-spanning plot as you introduce your aforementioned protagonist, who has no choice but to go by many names, before coloring in more of the present day we meet her in within the early pages of the story as a seemingly contented artist living with her husband and children in a remote corner of Donegal, the fall in 1999. When Saoirse wins a prestigious award, however, the Irish Times report ominously notes that she has established a reputation for maintaining a deliberate silence about her work and is generally unavailable for interview or comment. Despite her happy family and flourishing career, she's bound and trapped in so many ways, as we learn when we spiral back into her brutal youth. We don't initially see the horror of young Saoirse's life, but instead her flight from it. This mad dash to Ireland's a gripping read with vast consequences for the rest of the novel. Please take us back in time to meet Saoirse, aka Sarah Roy, and why she felt compelled to run away from her life in the first place.
There were a few threads actually. I knew I wanted to write about an artist, and I knew I wanted to place her in Ireland. So those were the first two. There was this idea that kind of came to me through a few news stories, which kind of they seem implausible if you live outside Ireland. But believe me, there's been so many news stories where people have disappeared into Ireland for various reasons. They've escaped wherever they're from, or they're here to lie low. Something's kind of gone awry in their home environment, in all different nationalities, and it's not one in particular, but it was the idea that every now and again somebody would say, oh, this person was discovered living here under either a false identity and sometimes not even under a false identity. And they went undetected until something else happened, and usually not the guards showing up at their door. It was usually some other incident where they got discovered, and this is in the 2000s when we had the technology, and it really appealed to my imagination to think, what about placing a young runaway into Ireland, you know, um, in the 90s before all this technology became prevalent. And, it certainly could have happened. And it's whatever reason that the government systems weren't set up here. Um, it is definitely something that has happened over and over, and has even been kind of mentioned on podcasts where they're kind of exploring these different ones. This is definitely a work of fiction. It is not based on any one of these stories, but just the idea that that could happen and has happened. And I just thought, gosh, and what would that be like? Because I know because I was from Michigan originally, and when I landed here in the 90s, it was such a soothing, calming place just from what life was like back in the 90s. And you can imagine what that would feel like now, the world as it is.
Now, once she begins her flight, as the New York Times previews, a 17-year-old Sarah on a Dublin-bound plane from Boston is traveling with a stolen passport of an Irish expat lookalike named Sarah Sasa Walsh. Her seatmate's an Irish medical student called Paul Byrne, who attentively and annoyingly chats Sarah up, and whose family will become her primary anchor. What is Sarah Roy running from? Who is Sarah Walsh? The author answers these questions through flashbacks and first-person italicized chapters that share titles with the paintings that'll hang in Saoirse's upcoming exhibition. It's a fascinating web she weaves here, not with bad intent, but to protect the life she's built for herself before it begins to feel like she might become a little trapped in it. Please take us deeper inside that interior exploration, if you will, of how her adapt and survive method begins to sound like what almost feels like a comfortable cage over time.
Sarah Walsh, who became Saoirse, discovered there are, a lot more pitfalls to living in Ireland. There's these unwritten rules, and these are the things that she's kind of up against in both between the laws that are in play here, and policies, and also dynamics.
What are some of those unwritten rules? That's fascinating.
Mm. Yeah, it's always really interesting to hear when people, it's a lovely place to visit. And I will say it is a lovely place to live. It's a lovely place to raise my family. Um, but there's definitely a learning curve. And tourists, you come as a tourist and it's an amazing place. The scenery is gorgeous. The people are just beautiful, so kind. Couldn't be nicer. But there is definitely a set of, you know, um, how do you even begin to describe in families, for example, there's a way of doing things, and there's a way, we've always done it this way. We don't question that. Or if you're in a work environment, you might have another more efficient way to do things, but we've always done it this way, so we keep going. And in a way, I guess I mean, so in Dublin, for example, where I live, people go to school together and they've known each other for all of their lives, and they met their best friends on the first day in junior infants, and these are their friends for life. And so it would be very hard to kind of get in. And some of my relationships, for example, would be the exact same way, would be the exact same as the day I met some of these people, and others. You flourish, you find, there's a part in my story where I say about finding this wall um, with new relationships. And in other cultures, yeah, you might be strangers at first. You find the wall, and you find things in common. It's not always the case. It's not always the case. And I'm sure this is like it in any, community, except for it's a really small community here. Ireland is. It's a very, very small community, and usually somebody knows. So some of the things that happen in the book, for example, where she's able to get her name changed, it's because her father-in-law knew somebody who would just be able to push that paperwork through. And, that was a thing. And, again, before systems were linked up, it was like, oh yeah, we know Rob down in the, revenue office, for example, like, not revenue, but, I know somebody who knows somebody who will be able to help you out with that. Or say going for jobs, you might not be the most qualified, but you might be the most known. And, I'm giving away all the secrets now. And I do think this has changed quite a bit because we've become quite international players now, and I think that ethic has changed. But when I got here, it was definitely, who do you know? Stay in your lane. Here's the phrase. It's stay in your lane, I think was a good rule to adhere to. So Paul, so when she arrives in Ireland, I mean, it's a great opportunity, so it seems. She meets a really friendly fellow, and as again, anytime you arrive in any place, you only see surface level of things, and you love the accent, and it's everything seems charming. And it's really hard to see through that until you start to get to know somebody. And I think so. Saoirse is coming from a very chaotic background. And just because you leave this chaos and just because you leave the abuse, it doesn't mean that your mindset all of a sudden switches onto a healthy one, And that's really something that I'm trying to drive home here as well is, the behaviors, the behaviors and the thinking just doesn't kind of to tidy up. So she arrives, and as I call Paul, she arrives on the scene with him, and he seems really lovely, great opportunity. He's very interested in her. And she really doesn't see what he's like until she starts to see him through his friends. And it's when she gets into that situation, it's already too late. We don't know it at the time, but it's already too late. And she's going to be stuck with him for a while. And she sees how he actually is and what his motives are, and that he has an agenda. And it is an agenda. He's kind of entitled. And I think, as her friend says later in the novel, yeah, it's an upgrade. It's an upgrade to this. She came from, I don't know how would I put that? From an obviously abusive situation, and she was exploited. In the situation now, Paul is from an educated background. He has a lovely family. They have a lovely home, and she does feel safe for a little while, but always intends to get out of there. And then it almost becomes impossible for her to leave the situation. She has a daughter with Paul, and that is so she can't just up and go. And part of her is also afraid that she's going to be, that she's going to be discovered. She can't up and flee the country. She can't go over to England because, part of the laws at the time, if she even, she didn't have a choice but to keep the baby when it came down to it, because she couldn't leave the country. She didn't have, proper identification. And every choice she made was bringing her one step closer to being discovered. And it's this mindset of, if you could just stay one step ahead of the problems. It's kind of like this hand to mouth thing. If you can just get the next meal, that's what you're thinking of in survival mode. So it's very much written from a survival mindset. And even when she's materially comfortable, once again, this never leaves her. She's always just keeping one step ahead of discovery. Then with her daughters as well, she has what's going to happen to her if she's discovered, who, her daughters are going to be left to, just to fate, really. And so it's all, her decisions, poor as they may be. I have an amazing quote from an amazing author who writes in this line of neglect, again, about that survivor's mindset and the choices that people have. And it really can be really frustrating I love reading novels where there is an assumption of material comfort or there's an assumption of basic needs being met. Um, but I don't often write from that place. And I find it really frustrating so I'm on a panel tomorrow, and I know that all the other authors are writing from this place of, like Anne Patchett, for example, um, would write these amazing stories. I love them. I love an Anne Patchett novel. I'd love to write an Anne Patchett novel, but I'd never be able to write from that assumption of safety, if that makes sense. For whatever reason, right now in my life, I'm still writing about this girl who needs to be brought through. So what I was saying about that and this idea that Saoirse makes poor choices, very, very poor choices. But so Katrina O'Sullivan, she writes nonfiction at the moment. She wrote a book called Poor, and she next week she has a book coming out called Hungry. And she says this: choice is a myth inflicted on poor people by people in positions of power. People who can change things prefer to let the undeserved feel like they are to blame rather than losing their position and making things fairer. And I just think that is so powerful. So Saoirse's choices are choices that um, aren't choices, they're decisions, they're survival decisions still, even when she has material comfort.
Now we're introduced to Saoirse's past through her paintings, as renderings of domestic subjects, lavender, chapstick, are paired with painful memories. The Irish Times notes, before bringing some welcome sun into her life, when her true love comes crashing through the overcast, rugged coast of Donegal, Ireland, where she and we all meet Dathi, a builder from Donegal, brooding and beautiful, with his absent Kenyan doctor father, even her name Saoirse he chooses. Please talk about how his presence impacts her life and her heart, as her freedom requires a good man and a prayer.
It's definitely, things have changed here, but it's just a calmer place on the surface. And then as Saoirse, Sarah Roy, who became Sarah Walsh, who became Saoirse, discovered there are, a lot more pitfalls to living in Ireland. There's these unwritten rules, and these are the things that she's kind of up against in both between the laws that are in play here, and, policies and also dynamics. It's always really interesting to hear when it's a lovely place to visit. And I will say it is a lovely place to live. It's a lovely place to raise my family. Um, but there's definitely a learning curve. And tourists, you come as a tourist and it's an amazing place. The scenery is gorgeous. The people are just beautiful, so kind. Couldn't be nicer. But there is definitely a set of, you know, um, how do you even begin to describe in families, for example, there's a way of doing things, and there's a way, we've always done it this way. We don't question that. Or if you're in a work environment, you might have another more efficient way to do things, but we've always done it this way, so we keep going. And in a way, I guess I mean, so in Dublin, for example, where I live, people go to school together and they've known each other for all of their lives, and they met their best friends on the first day in junior infants, and these are their friends for life. And so it would be very hard to kind of get in. And some of my relationships, for example, would be the exact same way, would be the exact same as the day I met some of these people, and others. You flourish, you find, there's a part in my story where I say about finding this wall um, with new relationships. And in other cultures, yeah, you might be strangers at first. You find the wall, and you find things in common. It's not always the case. It's not always the case. And I'm sure this is like it in any, community, except for it's a really small community here. Ireland is. It's a very, very small community. And then, of course, when she meets her true love interest, that's all the tension in the novel. Like, then that's what there is. That's what she has to lose. She meets a character called Dahi almost straight away when she lands in Ireland. But at this stage, she's a little bit wrapped up with Paul. But instantly they just have this connection. He's a little bit of an outsider, or perceives himself as an outsider. Just given his circumstances, his father was foreign born, and his father was black from Kenya. And in Ireland at the time of his birth, it was a very unusual thing. But he was a child, he was Irish, and he was brought up here. So he's very much Irish, but very much at times felt like he didn't belong. So I think there was just this connection between them in terms of both feeling like outsiders. Um, she had her art, and he had his art through his he was really an artisan builder. He would restore and was very interested in bringing things back to life. So they were both very quiet people. So there's a lot of things that they had in common. So Dahi, it kind of helps her every little step of the way. She buries her name a little bit more. And one of those episodes is when they first kind of have a romantic moment on a beach. They're away with friends, and they find some time together, and they're just stoned. She's stoned out of her mind, as you might have done back in the day on a beach when you're camping with your friends. And so she's high, and she's just giggling, and he tells her his name is Dahi, which means David, and she says, "Oh, give me it." So she says to him, "Give me a name," which is, just kind of a bit of fun. Give me an Irish name. And he goes through a few things, and she likes the sound of Saoirse, and she likes the fact that it means freedom, because obviously that's very much what she's doing. And a thing that happens here, and I think it happens in the States as well, like you'd get a nickname, like Liam becomes Limo, for example. Or I knew a Patrick who was known as Smiley, for whatever reason. So kind of along this tradition, Dahi starts calling her Saoirse, and then everybody kind of gets on board. And really it just helps her along in burying her identity a little bit more. And I think in this way, she starts believing who she is, and believing in her independence, and believing she actually has this new life. If she can just keep one step ahead of it all.
Now, when someone has a past, they're so eager to forget that it even includes their name. In Saoirse's mind, do you feel she ever really allows herself to mentally grow away from Sarah and then into the fuller potential version of her new self over the decade we spend with her?
I have to say it was fun doing this. It was fun kind of thinking about that and having to think through how would you walk into this. And there's a lot more scenes that got erased than actually made it into the book. And I think of some of those scenes when I think as I'm creating her, how would she walk into, even the supermarket? How would she address a new person? Or can she afford to get close to people and make friends? Or, I think at one stage she starts having intimate conversations with Dahi, and she can't even really tell him her sister's name. And it always comes up in her thoughts that, what do I have to give this man? I can't even tell him who I am or where I've come from. So, and it's not a past that she wants to remember anyway. But at the same time, you still, as they say, you have to be a good liar, don't you? If you have to, sorry, you have to have a good memory if you're going to be a good liar. And she must have a good memory. But I think also things develop where, she gets into her art, she throws herself into her art. And it's not until then she actually has to start talking about things. And okay, this is why she doesn't want to be interviewed. And this is where the tension kind of, it ups the tension. But also, I think, she wants to forget her past. She doesn't want to talk a whole lot about it. But then she develops languages around motherhood, so it's all about her children then. And she can talk about her kids without lying, she can talk about, these sort of experiences without going too far into, she can talk about the novels that she reads. I know I bring up Tess of the D'Urbervilles a lot, not a lot in a particular scene. So she's obviously a big reader. She, so she develops the language and the things that she does need to talk about when, when America or her past comes up. She even buries her accent is, but not intentionally, I don't think, because I do think you do just kind of develop a sense of kind of getting in with the, I think you do just try to blend in, whether you land in America or you land in Ireland, wherever, you just kind of get on board with the phrases or what have you. But yeah, I think it's always the sense of having to keep on her toes, keep on top of her game, but especially when she's exposed to the art, because this is when she's in danger.
Welcome to the club. Although it is important to note that before you got here, it wasn't exactly like you were artistically dormant. Also succeeding as a visual artist who enjoys technical work as well as using charcoal and drawing grasses, the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains, where the fruits of your labors, the Sunday Times noted, were then poured into the 2022 Landmarks exhibition at the Peirce Museum, the Rathfarnham, and as part of her collective. Your next installation, that co-created with photographer Tina Claffey, had many exhibitions, as well as your writing poems, essays, short fictions, including Milfoil. In reviewing this impressive history as an artist before becoming an author, please talk about how you utilized your own artistic side to create the work that Saoirse does on the page here, and how complicated it is to describe the art that she/you were making, as you do, after all, only see it in your imagination.
I have an art practice, but I mean it's nothing that what she painted is what I kind of invented in my head of what I would paint if I had those skills. But I would be more charcoals and nature things, and I definitely don't paint the way she does, but I do kind of know how I get into how I throw myself into that work, whether it's writing or whether it's art. But I did take I went, and particularly the Irish Arts Council is very good here. I've had a few bursaries, but one of them was for to be able to go and study painting for this. So I went and took a term at the National College of Art and Design, and just made sure that I had the techniques and was using some of the techniques, even though I would never show anything that I painted that term. I still got to see what other people were doing, and kind of what the process was, and even how do the instructors speak to you, and how do they talk to you about these things. And I had an artist that I know read some of the chapters, and she was very good, because she at one stage she was like, they're praising her way too much. She's like, no art teacher is going to give you, let you gain any notions about yourself. Like, yeah, no, pull back on that one. She is definitely not going to. So I did a little bit of editing in that terms. But yeah, so I definitely had to go and throw myself into that a little bit. I would walk around the National Galleries a lot, into different studios, just to see what people were doing, and what leapt out at me as an artist, as a viewer of art, and what I would have loved. And I try to picture that through Saoirse's eyes as well,
As you were approaching the moment of reckoning within Saoirse's story, how much did you find yourself wrestling with its potential outcomes, on the way to crafting what the American Library Association ultimately found to be a transcendent journey of discovery that radiates with exceptional honesty and lingering atmospheric depth?
I really wanted her to have um I really wanted her to have the ending she deserved, as somebody who has had to climb out time and time again from other people's messes. Um, I knew she had to pay for poor choices. I knew that had to be a thing. How much I wanted her to pay, I had to have a good look at that. Um, there is a Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I just happen to have a copy here. This book, there's a big, I don't know if you call it a parallel. Somebody called her the anti-Tess, Saoirse. I did, the Tess. This book is so beautiful and so awful, and I've never felt so more indignant about a book. I probably read this book when I was about 15, and was as just so horrified by what happened to Tess. And if you open it up, and the very first thing it says, gives the name, um, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, a pure woman. And I talk about that, and she wants to throw this book into the fire. I very much had this ending in mind when I wrote this, and I very much I wanted her to have redemption, unlike Tess, if that makes sense, and if that doesn't give too much away. So yes, she needed to pay, and I made sure she paid some sort of a price. There's also, I think, in my head, what would have happened next, and maybe a bit of scorn from the community, maybe, there's all sorts of things that would have happened and could happen. But I tried to keep the ending where she might find a bit of at least a bit of a place to rest for a while before she has to face into the next thing.
Now, did you enjoy spending enough time in this world that you could envision returning there again with readers in a sequel or perhaps a spin-off starring a different character from the story?
I have toyed, and I actually got some funding to do to continue on with the story, kind of the way, do you know the way Elizabeth Strout will take characters and community, and then she'll shift it and look at it from a different character's angle. I'd love to do something like that with Dahi's story. Dahi is, I think, a character, and as I was writing it, I had to erase and kind of take. No, I didn't erase. I had to take out and store somewhere else scenes about him and where he was coming from and what his perspective is, because this is very much Tess, I just call her Tess, it's very much Saoirse's story and from her perspective. I would love to tell it from his, and first of all, his past and what that felt like, but also I mean, because he became, as somebody said, Dahi is the partner we all deserve. How did he become such a good listener? How did he become such a, um, how did he become such a partner? Like, how did he know? So I'd love to go. How did he become such a good lover? For example, I'd love to go through his time and place him where he did go off and discover. He obviously had to leave Ireland to find out about himself. And in my head, and I think I kind of set it up at the end of the book. He goes off. He does go to New York. He goes to Kenya, to with his father for a little while. But he goes to New York, and in my head, this is where he really kind of discovers himself and his autonomy and himself away from the identity of being a black man in Ireland in the 90s or the 80s, actually, as a young boy, where he really kind of came into the pride of himself and then later with his family in Kenya. So I'd love to follow that trajectory. I I always put myself in his thinking, and I'd love to make that, to put that down on the page. So I did. I got a little bit of funding for that, and I've written some of that. It's a terrifying one because Tess I can very much relate to, and her emotional trajectory. He is just somebody I'm really curious about. So we'll see if that ever gets done, but.
Finally, forgetting about Saoirse for a second, what a journey you've had along your way to becoming a best-selling published author. For someone earlier on in that trek, what guideposts would you point them towards to arm them with the best shot at reaching that same dream come true?
As I always say, because I've done courses, I've done MFAs, I've done all sorts of things, but um, I find the best teacher is the reading, and all those readers or writers that I've just mentioned. Um, and I think all of them would say it's, you have this urge and believe that urge and just put it down and put it down and go to things where you start to build your community. Go to little writing workshops, go to writers' weeks, festivals, meet the writers, meet those who have made their name already, but make find your buddies there, those who are just starting out as well as you. And, I have so many, I've done courses and we've all gone away and we stick together and we're still reading for each other. And most of us have gotten published. So it is a journey, it is a journey, but it starts with the reading and then just being willing to put it down and start risking it, start doing little things like, maybe an open mic night, maybe a short story, competition. So, yeah, and it could, for most of us, it is a long road, but it's a great journey because you meet so many amazing people. I always say that I think if you keep at it, it's discouraging at first and you're thinking, oh, I don't look like any of them, I don't sound like any of them. But I do find if you keep going and you follow your own gut and you take, it's okay to take some advice, but I just always remember it's not a prescription. If somebody says, oh, I don't like that, say, good for you. But if you like it, keep going. And I just think you eventually write your way into what you need to say.
Charleen, it's been inspiring talking today. Thanks so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
It was lovely. It was great talking to you.